Thank you, Martin, and thanks to those of you who were able to ditch your need for political news and be here rather than wait for the announcement of new ministers. I also want to thank Lisbeth Bech-Nielsen from the Socialist People's Party for giving us this platform. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the Templeton Foundation, who have made this possible, Dreyers Fund, and also the Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy, the other Lisbeth, who has also been a supporter of this conference. Now, I just want to give a few brief remarks that try to sort of set the scene on how I see where we are on free speech globally. And I want to start with a bit of a triumph, actually. So this is a picture of Václav Havel, perhaps the greatest dissident ever, at least in my opinion, and one of the architects of the Velvet Revolution, signer of the famous Charter 77 that helped topple communism not only in Czechoslovakia but also in Europe as such. And sort of 4 or 5 months after Havel was released from prison, he was invited to Congress in the US to give a speech. And he had, of course, become president of his country, and he talked about how he had been living under one of the worst totalitarian communist governments in Europe. And then suddenly, I'm speaking to you as the representative of a country that has set out on the road to democracy, a country where there is complete freedom of speech. And this Havel speech in Congress, I think, was a key moment in a golden age for free speech globally. So the fall of communism, the third wave of democratization that saw democracy increase around the world, from Latin America to Eastern Europe, Africa, and so on. And there was a lot of optimism. And what was also important in this era was that democracies were actively promoting the idea of free speech. They were promoting dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, promoting apartheid activists in South Africa, and were really seeing free speech as an important tool for the promotion of democracy and freedom. Another key moment came a few years later when Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president in a free and multiracial South Africa. And shortly before assuming the presidency, Mandela gave a speech at the International Press Institute where he thanked international media and human rights organizations for providing a voice to those who had been silenced by apartheid. And it's not a well-known story, but the degree of censorship in apartheid South Africa was really, really staggering. Hate speech laws, for instance, would protect the white minority from being subjected to hatred. Someone like Mandela, of course, was put in prison, but he was also put under bans that banned people from quoting him, banned him from public meetings, and of course, someone like Stephen Biko was tortured to death during apartheid South Africa. But this was another key moment where free speech was really instrumental in shining a critical light on apartheid, providing a voice to those who were silenced within South Africa, and putting pressure on the apartheid regime to give up its cruel and inhuman oppression of the black and colored population. And technology was actually crucial. It was, you had cable TV, you had a much more globalized media environment that helped put these regimes under pressure. And technology was about to get supercharged. So with the internet, and here is really the epitome of Silicon Valley techno-optimist vision of the internet, John Perry Barlow's famous Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, which had this vision of a radically decentralized space which would allow anyone anywhere to communicate in real time outside the reach of any government control. So at this point in time, the optimism was great. Free speech, supercharged by technology, would bring freedom and progress and democracy to all corners of the world. Censorship, as we knew it, was consigned to the dust heap of history, and activists were able to say whatever they want. Even into the early 2000s, this optimism was kept up. This is a picture of a then young senator from Illinois called Barack Obama, who pioneered the use of internet and social media for political campaigning. And in 2006, he released a podcast on his blog where he talked about the importance of a neutral internet, and that only because of the internet he could say what he wanted without censorship. And Obama famously won the so-called Facebook generation in 2008 and 2012. It used social media to great effect to energize people, voters who might have been turned off by politics, and that was seen as another great vision of how the online environment, free speech, would mobilize for progress and freedom. However, what happened in the 2000s, and some of these statements, and also the Arab Spring, which also led to a lot of initial optimism, hit that changes were actually happening that were not so progressive. So China, for instance, is a good example. Li Xiaobo, a Nobel laureate, in 2008 emulated or tried to emulate Václav Havel, publishing his Charter 08, which called for human rights and freedom of expression in China. But unlike Havel, Liu Xiaobo ended up in prison, died of cancer, and when he died, the Communist Party of China was in more control than ever before, unlike in Eastern Europe, where communism tumbled and democracy won. And with its Great Firewall, China has really pioneered the reverse engineering of the original promise of the internet by erecting a Great Firewall that has institutionalized censorship and surveillance at a scale unprecedented in human history. And there are more bad news. If we look at the number of journalists imprisoned, we see a huge increase around the world. China is not alone. Egypt is another actor. Turkey, Myanmar, Iran, and Vietnam are among the worst offenders. And we also see that global internet freedom is in decline. So in many ways, China, for instance, has been exporting its version of the Great Firewall to a number of other authoritarian regimes who want to ensure that there can be no rerun of the Arab Spring, for instance. And you see some really worrying numbers. So, for instance, the share of the world's population living in autocracies has risen from 49% in 2011 to 70% in 2021. The number of countries threatening freedom of expression has also risen almost exponentially, as you can see from this data. And what we see is that the autocratizing countries, you see that the bottom bar is declines in free speech. So when you look at the factors that autocratizing countries crack down on, free speech is almost always at the very top. It is the first freedom under attack because autocrats know that you need to control the public sphere to ensure your power and insulate yourself from criticism, dissent, civil society, and political pluralism. And this takes many shapes. India, the world's largest democracy, has seen a huge and worrying downturn, for instance. But we also see a brazenness on parts of both governments, but also extremist movements. So the infamous murder of journalist Kamal Khashoggi is one example. The attacks on Salman Rushdie and Charlie Hebdo, another, an institutionalized form of intolerance. But unfortunately, unlike the days of the third wave of democratization, the 90s, even the 70s and 80s, where democracies really pushed for free speech, for instance, in order to push for democracy in communist states, today, many democratic leaders have begun to view free speech as a threat rather than the foundation for democracy. So you remember the first slide I had of Obama's optimistic speech about the internet in 2006. In 2020, in an interview with The Atlantic, Obama said that now he thought that online disinformation was the single biggest threat to American democracy. Emmanuel Macron, another prominent leader, thinks that extremists and terrorists are much better at using the internet than those who are democrats. So there's this feeling that free speech, especially on social media, is being weaponized against democracy, truth, and tolerance with little democratic accountability. And this leads to real-life consequences. So not only do we see a scope creep in laws restricting free speech, in fact, in this very building, the Danish Parliament, in the last 10 years or so, more laws restricting free speech have been adopted than at any other time since the end of World War II. Most of them are quite innocent compared to what you would see in Russia, to what you would see in Iran, and so on. But the totality of laws restricting free speech over a long period of time is likely to accumulate and erode the culture of free speech, which is, to my mind, essential for a thriving ecosystem of free speech. And I'll get back to the idea of a culture of free speech. But one of the silver linings from a government perspective of centralized social media platforms and the harm, hoaxes, and hatred that you can find on them is that they can be strong-armed to remove illegal or even undesirable content at unprecedented scale without the need for due process and by using increasingly sophisticated automated content moderation to remove millions of pieces of content that governments do not like. And in 2017, Germany adopted its famous NetzDG law, obliging big social media companies to remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours or risk huge fines. This was a good faith effort by the German government to protect its democracy from hatred and so on due to well-known historical circumstances. The problem with this is that the internet is a global, social media platforms are global, and authoritarians look to democracies and say, well, that's a great idea, Germany. Thank you for creating a blueprint for online censorship. And so what happened was that in Turkey, in Venezuela, in Russia, in more than 20 countries around the world, many of them authoritarian, explicitly referenced the NetzDG and adopted their own versions. These versions were much worse. They didn't have the same rule of law guarantees that the German one had. They are not subject to independent courts and so on. But nonetheless, they provide a degree of legitimacy. They provide whataboutery points to authoritarians who can rebut criticism from democracies and say, well, you have the same kind of laws. At the same time, we see, I think, worrying, I've taken an example here. One is from a COVID protest. It shows French President Emmanuel Macron depicted as Hitler. Now that's arguably not sophisticated political rhetoric, but the guy who did it was fined 10,000 euros. Now, if this was something that had been done in Turkey or in Russia, I think most of us would condemn it. We would say this is an outrageous crackdown on political speech, whether you think it's too crass, goes too far or not. But this is happening in Europe. I've taken these cartoons by a Finnish cartoonist who has poked fun at Erdogan, has poked fun at the theocratic regime in Iran. He was also questioned for hate speech by Finnish authorities. Very worrying developments in democratic Europe. So what can we do to reverse the free speech recession? And I hope we can go into some of these more. So I would argue that we need a new Helsinki movement for the digital age. Now, the Helsinki movement was, in the 1970s, the movement that was critical in legitimizing free speech, spreading free speech to communist states, providing legitimacy to people like Havel and others, and that helped create cracks in the Iron Curtain. We need democratic governments to stand up for robust and principled free speech standards both at home and abroad. We need to create awareness that the values of free speech and equality are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive, and that free speech is a shield protecting, not a weapon aimed at vulnerable groups and minorities. And we need citizens, those of us who actually enjoy free speech, to realize that free speech can never be taken for granted, and that once you become complacent, free speech entropy will erode hard-won freedoms. Think about it today. I mean, we're standing in Parliament. I've already said critical things about my government. I've said critical things about a number of other governments. Right now, I'm exercising my right to free speech, but we don't think of it as exercising free speech because we're in Denmark and I take it for granted. But there are hundreds of other countries where if I said some of the things that I said today, I would be picked up when I left the building or even before, and I would be disappeared into some dark prison. But I am exercising my right to free speech, and that should not be taken for granted, because it cannot be taken for granted. And go back to the years before 1849, that's when we got the Constitution and protection of free speech in Denmark. But there have been horrible examples of violations of free speech even in this countries. And then we also have to accept that free speech comes with harms and costs. Yes, free speech can be ugly. Free speech can sometimes lead to negative consequences, but from a historical point of view, the benefits have dramatically outweighed the harms. And we also need to realize that restricting free speech has too often been a cure worse than the disease. In fact, as Eric will expand upon, it is my view that free speech is the most important right. And all these seminal figures that you see here who have fought for the rights of women, racial minorities, religious minorities, have all used free speech, appealed to free speech as a principle, and all those who oppressed them have relied on censorship and repression as the primary tool for keeping them subjected. So finally, coming back to this idea of a culture of free speech, I think that George Orwell said it better than most. He says that the point is that the relative freedom which we enjoy depends on public opinion. If large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. If public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted, even if laws exist to protect them. So that ultimately means that it is up to each and one of us, especially those of us who have the benefit, the luxury of free speech, to not take it for granted, to use it actively, and to defend those who are not so lucky to enjoy free speech, even when our instinct is to say we don't like that kind of speech, we want it to be removed. Stand up for a principled, robust conception of free speech, both offline and online. Thank you very much.
Let me just one question. Are you too negative? New technology, could we argue, has put us in a place where we are exercising free speech, not just here, around the world, in a way that we didn't dream possible 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago. It's everywhere, and what you see as a negative development is a quite predictive reaction against it, from regimes, from groups, from institutions. But I mean, this is a story of the world, isn't it? But the fact is that we are in a much, much better place when it comes to freedom of speech. Look at Iran, look at China. I mean, the people are fighting over it now.
It is certainly true. You could argue that we still live in a golden age, but that it is in decline, I would argue, rather than in ascendancy, and that, you could say things that and have conversations. There are people around the world watching this, streaming this without censorship. So that gives us capabilities that we didn't have before. But the worrying thing is, I think, that at the same time where we build these capabilities, more and more controls are being baked into the system, both corporate and government-like. And I think you're right that it's in certain ways it's sort of history repeating itself. So you have what I call elite panic. You have this reaction every time there's a seismic shift in communications technology. You will have institutional gatekeepers who are worried about the effects. So in 1858, the New York Times would write about the dangers of the telegraph, and thought it was too fast for the truth. You will have pushback against the radio. You would have pushback against TV, and so on. So that's one element of it. But those pushbacks earlier have also led to great harms early on. So the telegraph at one point, the British Empire controlled 60% of traffic and censored the telegraph, and that led to bad results. So I think we have to be vigilant, but it also provides us opportunities that I think will find ways to route around some of the censorship. But if democracies and those enjoying free speech in democracies don't lead the way, if we start internalizing the ideas that free speech is dangerous, needs to be put on control, I think the future looks bleak.
Great. Give Jakob a hand. Thank you very much. Sit down and we'll go to the next speaker.